The dust swirled around Victoria Jensen's boots as she stood outside the telegraph office in Lusk, Wyoming Territory, her hands trembling with a fury she'd never felt before in all her 22 years. 3 marriage proposals rejected in as many months, and each one for the same damned reason. She clutched the latest letter in her fist, the words burned into her memory like a brand on cattle hide. Miss Jensen, while your intelligence is admirable, I require a wife who understands her place in the home. A woman of such extensive education would find ranch life beneath her station, and I need a companion who shares my simple values, not one who fills her head with books and figures. The telegram before that had been worse. Benjamin Thornton, a successful rancher from Cheyenne, had written that he needed a proper woman, not a walking encyclopedia. And the first rejection, from a merchant in Laramie, had simply stated he wanted a decoration for his arm at social functions, not someone who would correct his grammar at the dinner table. Victoria crumpled the letter and let it fall to the dusty street. The year was 1884, and women were supposed to be content with cooking, cleaning, and producing children. Never mind that she could calculate profit margins faster than any accountant in 3 territories. Never mind that she'd read more books than the territorial governor. Never mind that she spoke 3 languages and could discuss philosophy, politics, and poetry with equal eloquence. She was too smart for marriage, apparently. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father, God rest his soul, had encouraged her education before his death 5 years ago. He'd been a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania before moving west, and he'd treated Victoria's mind like the precious resource it was. Her mother had died when Victoria was just 8, and her father had poured all his love and knowledge into raising his only child. When he passed, he'd left her enough money to live comfortably for a few years, but that money was running dangerously low now. Hence the desperate search for a husband. Victoria walked down the main street of Lusk, her green eyes scanning the false-fronted buildings that lined both sides. The town had grown considerably since the railroad came through, and it buzzed with the kind of energy that came from opportunity and growth. Cowboys, miners, merchants, and railroad workers all mixed together in this remote corner of Wyoming Territory, creating a strange democracy of dirt and determination. The saloon doors swung open, and a tall man stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk. Victoria noticed him immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, though he certainly was, but because of the way he carried himself. There was a quiet confidence in his movements, a purposefulness that suggested he never wasted energy on anything unnecessary. He was probably close to 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were practical, well-worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, scuffed leather boots, and a hat that had seen better days. But everything was clean and well-maintained, speaking to a man who took care of what he owned. Their eyes met for just a moment, his brown eyes sharp and assessing, and then he tipped his hat politely and walked past her toward the general store. Victoria continued to the boarding house where she'd been living for the past 6 months, each day eating away at her dwindling funds. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, was sweeping the front steps when Victoria arrived. "Any luck with your correspondence today, dear Mrs.?" Patterson asked, her round face creased with concern. She was a widow herself and understood the precarious position unmarried women found themselves in out west. "No," Victoria said simply, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. "Something will work out, you'll see, Mrs." Patterson said, but her tone lacked conviction. Victoria went up to her small room and sat on the narrow bed, staring out the window at the endless Wyoming sky. What was she supposed to do? Pretend to be stupid to catch a husband? Hide her education like it was something shameful? The thought made her stomach turn. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Miss Jensen, there's a gentleman downstairs asking to see you," Mrs. Patterson called through the door. Victoria's heart leaped despite herself. Perhaps one of the men had reconsidered. She quickly checked her reflection in the small mirror, smoothing her brown hair and straightening her simple blue dress before heading downstairs. The man waiting in Mrs. Patterson's parlor wasn't any of her rejected suitors. It was the cowboy she'd seen outside the saloon earlier. He stood when she entered, removing his hat to reveal hair plastered down with sweat. "Miss Jensen, my name is Matthew Zimmerman. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I heard in town that you've been corresponding with men about potential marriage arrangements." Victoria felt her cheeks burn. News travels fast in small towns. "It does," he agreed. "I'll be direct because I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. It's not the biggest spread in Wyoming, but it's mine, free and clear. I run about 300 head of cattle, and I've got plans to expand if this year's market holds." He paused, and Victoria waited, her heart beating strangely fast. "I'm looking for a wife," he continued, "but not the kind most men seem to want. I don't need someone to just look pretty and keep house. I need a partner. Someone who can help me run the ranch, keep the books, make decisions when I'm out on the range. Someone with a brain in her head who isn't afraid to use it." Victoria stared at him, certain she must have misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "I heard you got rejected by Ben Thornton because you were too educated. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. A man who doesn't want a smart wife is a fool." Matthew's expression was serious, almost stern. "I need a partner, not a decoration. If you're half as intelligent as people say, then you're exactly what I'm looking for." "You're proposing marriage?" Victoria asked, still trying to process what was happening. "I'm proposing we talk about it," Matthew corrected. "I won't ask a woman to marry me when we've only just met. But I'd like the opportunity to get to know you, and for you to see the ranch. If we suit each other, then yes, I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." Victoria sat down slowly in one of Mrs. Patterson's worn armchairs. This had to be some kind of joke. Men didn't seek out intelligent women. They avoided them like smallpox. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you want an educated wife when every other man west of the Mississippi seems to prefer women who can't add 2 and 2? Matthew sat down across from her, his hat balanced on his knee. "Because I'm building something out here, Miss Jensen. This territory is young, and the opportunities are endless for people willing to work hard and think smart. My father was a rancher, and my mother couldn't read or write. She was a good woman, a kind woman, but when my father died, she lost everything because she didn't understand the business side of ranching. Unscrupulous men took advantage of her ignorance, and she died in poverty." His jaw tightened, and Victoria saw real pain in his eyes. "I swore that would never happen to any wife of mine," he continued. "I want a woman who can stand beside me, not behind me, who can run that ranch as well as I can if something happens to me, who can teach our children, not just to read and write, but to think critically and question everything." "You want children?" Victoria asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Eventually, if we're blessed with them, but I'm getting ahead of myself." Matthew leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Look, I know this is unusual, but out here, we don't have the luxury of following all the Eastern social rules. I need help running my ranch, and I believe you need a home and a future. Maybe we can help each other." Victoria studied him carefully. He seemed sincere, but she'd been fooled before by men who said one thing and meant another. What exactly would you expect from a wife? Honestly, everything. Keeping house, yes, but also helping with the books, making business decisions, occasionally helping with ranch work when needed. Learning to shoot, because predators come in both animal and human varieties out here, being my equal in all things that matter. He met her eyes steadily. In return, I'd expect you to treat me with the same respect and partnership. Your opinions would matter. Your knowledge would be valued. You'd have a say in every major decision we make. That's not how most marriages work, Victoria said carefully. I'm not most men. Matthew stood and placed his hat back on his head. I understand this is a lot to consider. Why don't you come out to the ranch tomorrow? See the place. Ask me whatever questions you want, and then decide if it's even worth pursuing further. I'll pick you up at 8 in the morning if you're willing. Victoria should have said no. Should have asked for references, written to people who knew him, taken time to investigate his character. But something in his direct gaze and straightforward manner made her trust him, at least enough for a visit. 8 o'clock, she agreed. The smile that crossed Matthew's face transformed it completely, revealing dimples and laugh lines that suggested he didn't smile often, but when he did, it was genuine. I'll see you then, Miss Jensen. After he left, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, practically vibrating with curiosity. What did he want? He wants to marry me because I'm too smart, Victoria said, still not quite believing it herself. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. Matthew Zimmerman. Oh, honey, he's a good man. A bit rough around the edges, but honest as the day is long. He's been running that ranch by himself for 3 years now since his brother moved to California. Everyone respects him. Victoria went to bed that night with her mind spinning. She barely slept, alternating between excitement and skepticism. This could be her answer, or it could be another disappointment waiting to happen. Only time would tell. Matthew arrived promptly at 8 the next morning, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 well-kept horses. He helped Victoria up to the seat beside him with a calloused hand that was surprisingly gentle, and they set off north out of Lusk. The morning air was crisp and clear, and Victoria could see for miles across the rolling prairie. Antelope grazed in the distance and hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. It's beautiful, Victoria said, meaning it. It is, Matthew agreed. Harsh sometimes, but beautiful. Winter can be brutal and summer can be just as bad. But there's something about this land that gets into your blood. They talked as they rode, and Victoria was surprised by how easy it was to converse with him. Matthew asked her about her education and actually seemed interested in her answers. When she mentioned studying Latin, he asked her why it was useful, listening thoughtfully as she explained how it helped with understanding English and other Romance languages. In turn, he told her about ranching. Not in a condescending way, but as one professional might explain their work to another. He talked about breeding cycles, market prices, the challenges of finding good ranch hands, and the constant battle against rustlers, weather, and disease. A lot of people think ranching is just riding horses and roping cattle, Matthew said. But it's mostly business decisions and manual labor. For every hour I spend in the saddle, I spend 2 doing paperwork, fixing fences, or hauling supplies. The ranch, when they arrived, was more impressive than Victoria had expected. The main house was a solid timber structure with a stone foundation and a covered porch. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was well built and well maintained. A barn, stable, and several outbuildings completed the complex, all arranged around a central yard. Matthew helped her down from the wagon and showed her around. The house was clean but sparse, clearly the home of a bachelor who spent most of his time working. The kitchen was functional, the bedroom adequate, and there was a small room Matthew called his office, where ledgers and papers covered a sturdy desk. "I won't lie and say keeping house here is easy," Matthew said. "There's no running water, we're 10 miles from town, and the winters are isolated. But the house is sound, and there's room to expand if needed." Victoria ran her hand along the desk in the office, looking at the neat columns of figures in the ledgers. The handwriting was clear, the mathematics correct, but she could see where better organization might help. "Do you use a double-entry bookkeeping system?" she asked. Matthew blinked. "A what?" "Double-entry bookkeeping. It's a method where every transaction is recorded twice as both a debit and a credit. It helps catch errors and gives you a more complete picture of your financial position." Victoria picked up one of the ledgers. "May I, please?" Matthew said, genuine curiosity in his voice. Victoria spent the next 20 minutes examining his books, and Matthew watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Finally, she looked up. "Your records are accurate, but you're not maximizing your efficiency. With a proper system, you could track expenses more precisely, project future costs more accurately, and probably find ways to cut unnecessary spending." She hesitated. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to criticize." "No, please continue," Matthew said, leaning against the desk. "This is exactly what I was hoping for." They spent the next hour discussing his ranch finances, and Victoria felt more alive than she had in months. Matthew asked intelligent questions, understood her explanations quickly, and seemed genuinely excited about implementing her suggestions. "Miss Jensen," he said finally, "I think we might suit each other very well." Victoria felt warmth spreading through her chest. "I think we might." They walked outside, and Matthew showed her the rest of the ranch. They saw the cattle grazing in distant pastures, the horses in the corral, the vegetable garden that clearly needed a woman's touch, and the small bunkhouse where the 2 ranch hands who worked for Matthew stayed. The men, Tom and Charlie, were both older cowboys who'd been working for Matthew for years. They tipped their hats respectfully to Victoria and didn't seem surprised to see a woman on the ranch. "Boss said he was looking for a partner," Tom said with a gap-toothed smile. Glad to see he meant it literal. As the day wore on, Victoria felt more certain. This place, this life, this man, they all felt right in a way nothing else had since her father died. When Matthew drove her back to town that evening, the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that took her breath away. "Miss Jensen," Matthew said as they approached Lusk, "I'd like to court you properly if you're willing. I know we could rush into marriage as many people do out here, but I'd rather we take time to be sure." "I'd like that," Victoria said softly. Over the next 2 months, Matthew visited Victoria in town twice a week, and she went out to the ranch every Sunday. They talked about everything: their pasts, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Matthew told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about losing his father to a riding accident when he was 16, about watching his mother's decline and eventual death. Victoria shared her own grief over losing her parents, her love of learning, her frustration with a society that saw educated women as threats rather than assets. But they also laughed together. Matthew had a dry sense of humor that caught Victoria off guard, and she discovered she could make him laugh with her sharp observations about human nature. They debated politics and discussed books. Matthew admitted he wasn't much of a reader, but he listened with genuine interest when Victoria talked about literature, and he surprised her by having strong, well-reasoned opinions on subjects she wouldn't have expected a cowboy to consider. "Just because I work with my hands doesn't mean I don't use my head," he said one afternoon when she expressed surprise at his knowledge of territorial politics. "I might not have your formal education, Miss Jensen, but I'm not stupid." "I never thought you were," Victoria said quickly. I apologize if I made you feel that way. Matthew smiled. I'm teasing you, mostly, but it's a good reminder that intelligence comes in many forms. You know books and numbers, I know cattle and land. Together, we'd make quite a team. The word together made Victoria's heart skip. As autumn arrived and the cottonwoods along the creek turned golden, Victoria realized she'd fallen in love. It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping passion of novels. It was quieter than that, steadier. It was the way Matthew always listened when she talked, really listened, asking follow-up questions and remembering details she'd mentioned weeks before. It was how he valued her opinions, asking her advice on ranch decisions and actually following her suggestions. It was the respect in his eyes when he looked at her. The way he never once made her feel like her intelligence was something to hide or apologize for. One Sunday in late October, after they'd spent the afternoon going over his books together and planning for the winter ahead, Matthew asked her to walk with him down to the creek that ran through his property. The air was cool, and Victoria pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The grass was brown now, preparing for winter, and the cattle had been moved to pastures closer to the ranch buildings. Victoria, Matthew said, and her heart jumped at his use of her first name. They'd been formal until now, keeping to Miss Jensen and Mr. Zimmerman even as their relationship deepened. I think you know how I feel about you. I think I do, she said softly. I'm not good with fancy words, Matthew continued, but you've become essential to me. Not just because you're brilliant with numbers and you've already helped me see ways to improve the ranch, but because you make me laugh. You challenge me to think differently. You're strong and brave and kind, and I can't imagine my life without you in it now. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Will you marry me, Victoria Jensen? Will you be my partner in all things? Will you help me build something lasting out here, something we can be proud of? Victoria felt tears prickling her eyes. Yes, she said. Yes, Matthew, I will. The kiss they shared was her first, sweet and gentle and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. I don't have a ring yet, Matthew admitted. I wanted to be sure of your answer before I spent the money. That's perfectly sensible, Victoria said, and Matthew laughed. Only you would find practical budgeting romantic. It is romantic, Victoria insisted. It shows you're thinking about our future, about making smart financial decisions for our partnership. Our partnership, Matthew repeated, pulling her close. I like the sound of that. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Lusk. Mrs. Patterson cried. Tom and Charlie served as witnesses, and the preacher kept the service brief at Matthew's request. Victoria wore a new dress she'd made herself, a deep blue that matched her eyes, and Matthew wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but handsome. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Matthew kissed her in front of the small gathering of townspeople who'd come to witness the wedding, Victoria felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she was meant to be. This was the life she was meant to live. The ranch became her home that day, and Victoria threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm. She reorganized the office, implemented a proper bookkeeping system, and discovered that Matthew was right. She could find ways to cut costs and increase efficiency. Within the first month, she'd identified several areas where they were losing money unnecessarily, but she also learned the practical skills of ranch life. Matthew taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could hit a target consistently. She learned to recognize signs of illness in cattle, to predict weather changes by reading the sky, and to ride a horse well enough to help move cattle when absolutely necessary. The winter was hard, just as Matthew had warned. Snow fell heavy and often, and there were days when they couldn't leave the ranch at all. But Victoria discovered she didn't mind the isolation. She and Matthew would sit by the fire in the evenings, she reading while he mended tack or worked on small repairs. Sometimes they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's presence. The physical side of their marriage developed naturally. Matthew was patient and gentle, never demanding, always making sure Victoria was comfortable. She appreciated his consideration, and as the weeks passed, their intimacy deepened into something that felt as much like partnership as everything else in their relationship. When spring arrived, Victoria had been married for 5 months and felt like she'd lived at the ranch forever. The work increased dramatically as calving season began, and Victoria found herself working 16-hour days alongside Matthew and the ranch hands. She helped pull calves, treated sick animals, and kept meticulous records of every birth and death. One morning in April, she was checking the books when she noticed something alarming. Their expenses for feed had increased dramatically over the past 2 months, but they hadn't bought any additional cattle. "Matthew," she called out to the yard where he was shoeing a horse. "Can you come look at this?" He came into the office, wiping his hands on a rag. Victoria showed him the figures. "We're going through feed twice as fast as we should be," she said. "Either the cattle are eating far more than normal, which doesn't make sense, or someone is stealing from us." Matthew's expression darkened. "How long has this been going on?" "I didn't notice at first because the increase was gradual, but looking back, it started in February." Victoria pointed to the columns. "See, small amounts at first, but it's getting worse." "Rustlers," Matthew said grimly. "They've been hitting some of the smaller ranches south of here. I'd hoped we were too far north, but apparently not." Over the next few days, Matthew and his ranch hands began riding the property more frequently, looking for signs of theft. Victoria continued tracking the supplies, noting every discrepancy. She also started keeping a log of when the thefts occurred, looking for patterns. "They're hitting us every 10 to 12 days, she told Matthew one evening, showing him her chart. "Always at night, always taking just enough that we might not notice immediately. They're smart." "So are you," Matthew said, studying her notes. "Based on this timing, they should hit us again in the next 2 or 3 nights. We'll be ready." Matthew, Tom, and Charlie took turns keeping watch, hidden in locations where they could see the feed storage barn. Victoria wanted to help, but Matthew was firm. "I need you safe in the house," he said. "If something happens to me, you need to be able to run this ranch and keep it going." The thought of something happening to Matthew made Victoria's stomach clench, but she understood his reasoning. She stayed in the house, watching from the window, a rifle loaded and ready just in case. On the 3rd night, Victoria heard gunshots. Her heart leaped into her throat and she grabbed the rifle, running out onto the porch. In the distance, she could see figures moving near the barn, could hear shouting. Then silence. Victoria stood frozen, terrified, until she saw Matthew walking back toward the house, limping slightly but alive. She ran to him, setting the rifle aside and throwing her arms around him. "I'm fine," he assured her, holding her tight. "Just took a tumble when my horse spooked. We caught them, Victoria. 3 men trying to load our feed into their wagon. Tom's bringing the sheriff from town." The rustlers turned out to be drifters, part of a larger gang that had been hitting ranches throughout the territory. With the evidence Victoria had compiled, the prosecution was straightforward, and the men were sentenced to prison time. The incident, scary as it was, seemed to solidify something between Victoria and Matthew. They'd faced a threat together, each using their particular skills to protect what they were building. Matthew's respect for Victoria's contributions had been clear from the start, but now The whole county knew about the smart wife who'd helped catch the rustlers through her careful bookkeeping. Summer came hot and dry, and Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told Matthew one evening in July, nervous despite knowing he wanted children. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down, worried he'd hurt her. "Are you well? Do you need anything? Should we send for a doctor?" The questions tumbled out, and Victoria laughed. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies forever. But yes, we should probably arrange for a midwife as we get closer to my time." Matthew became even more protective, insisting she not overwork herself. Victoria continued managing the books and making business decisions, but she let Matthew take on more of the physical labor. As her belly grew, she found herself content to work from the house, planning for the future. They spent the long summer evenings talking about their child, about what they hoped to teach, about the world they wanted to create for the next generation. Matthew built a cradle with his own hands, carving intricate designs into the wood during quiet moments. Victoria gave birth on a freezing February morning in 1886, with Mrs. Patterson and a midwife from town attending her. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Victoria thought she might not survive. But finally, as dawn broke over the snowy prairie, she heard the strong cry of her son. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the baby in Victoria's arms. "A healthy, strong boy." Matthew, who'd been pacing outside like a caged animal, came in and stood beside the bed, staring down at his son with an expression of wonder. "He's perfect," Matthew whispered. "You're perfect. Thank you, Victoria." They named him Marcus, and he became the center of their world. Victoria was amazed by how naturally Matthew took to fatherhood. He'd change diapers without complaint, walk the floor with Marcus during colicky nights, and talk to the baby about the ranch as if he could understand every word. "He needs to know what he'll inherit someday," Matthew explained when Victoria teased him about having one-sided conversations with an infant. "He needs to understand that this isn't just land and cattle, it's legacy." As Marcus grew, Victoria realized that the life she'd built with Matthew was everything she'd never dared to dream of. She had a partner who valued her mind as much as her domestic skills, who asked her opinion on everything from which bulls to buy to how to invest their profits. The ranch was thriving under their joint management, and they'd become one of the most successful operations in the county. But more than that, she had love. Real, deep, abiding love. The kind that grew stronger with every challenge they faced together, with every decision they made as partners, with every quiet moment they stole for themselves amidst the endless work of ranch life. On their third wedding anniversary, Matthew gave her a gift, a hand-bound book with blank pages. "I thought you could write down your thoughts, your ideas, maybe some of the stories you tell Marcus," he explained. "Your mind is too brilliant to not leave a record of it." Victoria felt tears welling up. In a society that told her she was too smart to be wanted, she'd found a man who celebrated her intelligence, who encouraged her to use every bit of her education and natural ability. "I love you," she said, not for the first time, but with a depth of feeling that still surprised her. "Thank you for seeing me for who I really am." "How could I not?" Matthew said, pulling her close. "You're extraordinary, Victoria. You always have been. I'm just lucky enough to be the man who realized it." The years passed in a blur of hard work and quiet happiness. Marcus grew into a bright, curious child who loved learning as much as his mother and loved the land as much as his father. When he was 3, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter, Emily, who came into the world screaming her displeasure at being born during a thunderstorm. Matthew adored his daughter, and Victoria would often find him reading to her from the books Victoria treasured, his rough cowboy voice gentled for the little girl in his arms. The ranch continued to prosper. Victoria's financial management and Matthew's skill with cattle created a combination that other ranchers began to notice and emulate. They expanded their holdings, buying adjoining land when it became available, and hired more ranch hands as the operation grew. But success didn't change them. Matthew was still the same direct, honest man who'd sought out Victoria because he needed a partner. Victoria was still the woman who found romance in practical planning, and who'd rather discuss cattle prices than attend fancy social functions. In 1890, Wyoming achieved statehood, and women in Wyoming already had the right to vote, a right they'd held in the territory since 1869. Victoria took her civic duties seriously, studying the candidates and issues carefully before casting her ballot. Matthew encouraged her political interest, even when they disagreed on certain issues. "Debate makes both of us sharper," he'd say after a particularly spirited discussion about territorial politics. "Besides, how boring would life be if we agreed on everything?" One evening in the fall of 1891, after the children were asleep and they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matthew took Victoria's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Regret what? Marrying me? Living out here? You could have gone east, found some wealthy man who could have given you a different kind of life. Theaters and libraries and fancy parties." Victoria turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes that he rarely showed. "Matthew Zimmerman, you asked me to be your partner, not your decoration. You gave me a life where my mind is valued, where I can be fully myself, where I'm respected and loved for who I actually am, not who society thinks I should be. How could I possibly regret that?" She squeezed his hand. "Those other men rejected me for being too smart. You sought me out because of it. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. A true partnership, a family, a purpose. I love you more than I can express." Matthew pulled her into his arms, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, comfortable in the silence that came from truly knowing another person. "I'm the lucky one," Matthew finally said. "When I heard Ben Thornton had rejected you for being too educated, I couldn't believe my good fortune. His loss was my gain." Victoria laughed. "I suppose I should thank him. If he'd been smart enough to appreciate me, I never would have met you." "No," Matthew agreed. "And I'd still be struggling alone, making half the profits and twice the mistakes." As the years continued to unfold, Victoria and Matthew built more than just a successful ranch. They built a model for what marriage could be when two people respected each other as equals. They raised their children to value education and hard work equally, to understand that intelligence came in many forms, and that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect. Marcus grew up to be a young man who loved ranching but also loved learning. He went to university in Laramie for 2 years, studying agricultural science, then came home to help run the family ranch with new knowledge and ideas. Victoria and Matthew encouraged him, excited to see their legacy continued and improved upon. Emily proved to have her mother's head for figures and her father's love of horses. She could calculate profit margins while riding at full gallop, and she had opinions on everything from breeding programs to market timing. Some of the older ranchers in the area didn't quite know what to make of a girl who could outthink and outride most of their sons, but Matthew and Victoria couldn't have been prouder. In 1895, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when Victoria first came to the ranch, she and Matthew stood on the porch watching their children work with the ranch hands. Marcus was 22 now, Emily 12, and Victoria was 45. Strands of gray streaked her brown hair, and Matthew's temples had gone silver, but the partnership between them was as strong as ever. "Remember when you told me you needed a partner, not a decoration?" Victoria asked, leaning against Matthew's shoulder. "Best decision I ever made," Matthew said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "Though I'm not sure I deserve credit for it, more like common sense." "It wasn't common sense to most men," Victoria reminded him. "You were unusual then, and you still are." "Maybe," Matthew acknowledged. "But I think times are changing. More men are realizing what I knew from the start, that a smart wife is an asset, not a threat. That partnership makes everything better." Victoria looked out at the land they'd built their life on, at the home they'd created, at the children they'd raised to value both intelligence and integrity. She thought about the girl she'd been, standing in the street in Lusk with a crumpled rejection letter in her hand, wondering if she'd ever find a place where she belonged. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she said softly. "Thank you for seeing me, Matthew, for valuing me, for loving me." "Always," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always and forever." As the sun set over their ranch, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Victoria knew that she'd found something rare and precious. Not just love, though she had that in abundance. Not just partnership, though that too was theirs. But the freedom to be fully herself, intelligence and all, and to be cherished for it. She'd been rejected for being too smart, and in that rejection had found the greatest blessing of her life. Because Matthew hadn't needed a decoration. He'd needed a partner, and together they'd built something that would last long after they were gone. Their story became something of a legend in the area. People would point to the Zimmerman ranch as proof that modern partnerships could succeed, that valuing women's intelligence didn't undermine marriage but strengthened it. Young women facing their own rejections for being too much would hear about Victoria and take heart. Young men would hear about Matthew and learn that seeking an equal partner wasn't weakness but wisdom. In the spring of 1896, Victoria gave birth to their third child, a surprise baby they named Sarah, who arrived when Victoria was 46 and Matthew was 44. The pregnancy had been unexpected, and Dr. Morrison from town had expressed concern given Victoria's age, but she came through the birth healthy and strong. 3 children, Matthew said, cradling tiny Sarah while Marcus and Emily crowded around to see their new sister. "Our cup runneth over." "Indeed it does," Victoria agreed, tired but content. Sarah grew up in a household that was unlike most others in Wyoming. Her mother ran a successful ranch, kept impeccable books, and had opinions on everything from politics to philosophy. Her father treated his wife as an equal partner, asked her advice on all major decisions, and encouraged all his children to pursue education alongside practical skills. The younger children in the area grew up seeing the Zimmerman marriage as normal, not understanding how revolutionary it actually was. To them, it made perfect sense that Victoria would ride out to check on cattle and then come home to teach Emily mathematics. It seemed natural that Matthew would ask his wife's opinion on which bulls to purchase and take her advice seriously. As the new century approached, the Zimmerman ranch was one of the most prosperous in the state. Victoria's careful financial management had seen them through drought, harsh winters, and market fluctuations that had ruined other ranchers. Matthew's skill with cattle and his willingness to adopt new methods had kept their herd healthy and productive. On New Year's Eve 1899, as the 19th century prepared to give way to the 20th, the entire family gathered in the ranch house for a celebration. Marcus was 27 now, engaged to a school teacher from Cheyenne who reminded Victoria a bit of herself. Emily was 16, already running the ranch's books and talking about studying accounting in Laramie. Sarah was 3, a whirlwind of energy and questions who kept everyone on their toes. Tom and Charlie, now both in their 60s, joined them for dinner along with the other ranch hands and their families. Mrs. Patterson, elderly but still spry, had come out from town for the occasion. As midnight approached, Matthew stood to make a toast. He raised his glass, looking around the room at all the people who made up their extended family. "To partnership," he said, his eyes finding Victoria's across the room. "To the courage to value intelligence over convention, to respect over tradition, and to love that makes us better than we could ever be alone." "To partnership," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Victoria met Matthew's gaze and smiled. 28 years of marriage, and she still felt that flutter in her chest when he looked at her like she was the most remarkable person in the world. Later, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Victoria and Matthew stood outside under the stars. The night was cold and clear, and Victoria could see the Milky Way stretched across the heavens. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, pulling her close for warmth. "I'm thinking about that girl standing in the street with a rejection letter, feeling like she'd never find her place in the world," Victoria said. "And I'm thinking how grateful I am that she didn't give up, that she held out for something real." "I'm grateful too," Matthew said. "Grateful that you gave me a chance. Grateful that you saw past the rough cowboy to the man who just wanted a partner to build a life with." "You were never just a rough cowboy," Victoria said. "You were always more than that. You had the wisdom to understand what really matters in a marriage." As the new century began, Victoria and Matthew stood together under the stars, partners in every sense of the word. They'd faced challenges and triumphs, had built a family and a legacy, and through it all, had maintained the respect and love that had drawn them together in the first place. The years that followed brought their own joys and sorrows. They celebrated Marcus's wedding and welcomed his children. They supported Emily as she became one of the first female accountants in Wyoming, opening her own practice in Cheyenne while still helping manage the ranch's finances. They watched Sarah grow into a young woman who combined her mother's intelligence with her father's practicality. In 1910, when Victoria was 60 and Matthew 58, they decided to gradually hand over the day-to-day operations of the ranch to Marcus, who had proven himself more than capable. They remained involved in major decisions, but they finally had time to enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. Victoria started a small school on the ranch, teaching local children reading, writing, and arithmetic. Matthew worked with young ranchers in the area, sharing the knowledge he'd accumulated over 40 years of running a successful operation. Together, they became pillars of their community, proof that intelligence, hard work, and partnership could create something lasting. One evening in the summer of 1912, they sat on the porch as they had countless times before, watching the sun set over land they'd worked together for nearly 3 decades of marriage. "You know what I love most about our life?" Victoria asked. "Tell me," Matthew said, taking her hand. "That we built it together. Every decision, every challenge, every triumph, we faced it all as partners. You never asked me to be less than I was. You never made me hide my intelligence or pretend to be someone I wasn't." "Why would I?" Matthew asked. "Your intelligence is one of the things I love most about you, always has been." "I know," Victoria said, "and that's what makes you extraordinary. You understood what so many men didn't. That a smart wife makes a man's life richer, not harder. That partnership is stronger than dominance." Matthew was quiet for a moment, then said, You made me extraordinary, Victoria. I was just a cowboy with a ranch. You turned this into an empire. You raised remarkable children. You challenged me to be better, to think deeper, to dream bigger." "We did all that together," Victoria corrected gently. "That's what partnership means." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her from a desperate, rejected woman to this moment of profound contentment. She thought about all the women who'd been told they were too smart, too opinionated, too educated. She hoped that her story might inspire them to hold out for something real, for someone who would value them completely. The next generation was already showing signs of change. Marcus's wife was an active partner in their portion of the ranch. Emily's success as an accountant had inspired other young women to pursue careers beyond teaching or nursing. Sarah, now 16, talked casually about attending university, something that would have been almost unthinkable when Victoria was that age. Progress was slow, but it was happening. And Victoria and Matthew had played their small part in showing what was possible when two people truly respected each other. In their later years, Victoria and Matthew became something of local celebrities. Newspapers occasionally featured articles about their successful partnership, holding them up as an example of modern marriage. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Victoria and Matthew would share the simple wisdom they'd learned over decades together. "Find someone who values all of you," Victoria would tell young women. "Don't settle for someone who wants you to diminish yourself to make them feel bigger. Find someone whose strengths complement yours," Matthew would tell young men. "Pride is a poor substitute for partnership." They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1925, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch that had once been Matthew's solo operation now spanned thousands of acres and employed dozens of people. The Zimmerman name was synonymous with successful ranching throughout Wyoming. But for Victoria and Matthew, the real success wasn't measured in acres or cattle or profits. It was measured in the life they'd built together, in the family they'd raised, in the example they'd set for what marriage could be when both partners were truly equal. As Victoria looked around at the gathered family, she caught Matthew's eye across the room. He smiled at her, that same genuine smile that had transformed his face on the day they met, and she smiled back. 40 years, and she still loved him as deeply as ever. Maybe more, because now that love was layered with decades of shared experience, of challenges faced together, of quiet moments and loud disagreements, and everything in between that made up a real marriage. That night, after everyone had left and they were alone in the house that had been their home for 4 decades, Matthew took Victoria in his arms and danced with her in the kitchen, humming a tune from their youth. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For saying yes when I asked you to come to the ranch that first time, for giving me a chance, for building this life with me." Matthew pulled back to look at her face, lined now with age but still beautiful to him, "for being exactly who you are." "Thank you for wanting a partner," Victoria replied, "for seeing my intelligence as an asset instead of a threat, for loving me, all of me, without reservation." They swayed together in the lamplight, two people who'd taken a chance on each other and had been rewarded beyond measure. Victoria lived to be 82, passing peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1932 with Matthew holding her hand. Her last words were, "Thank you for the life we built together." Matthew followed her 2 years later, his heart giving out while he sat on the porch watching the sunset over the land he'd loved. His children found him there, peaceful, a small smile on his face, as if he'd seen something wonderful just before he died. They buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that read, Victoria Jensen Zimmerman, 1850–1932, partner, mother. Pioneer Matthew Zimmerman, 1854–1934, partner, father, rancher, but their real legacy wasn't carved in stone. It lived on in their descendants, in the stories told about the couple who'd built an empire through partnership, in the example they'd set for what marriage could be when two people truly valued each other as equals. The ranch continued to thrive under Marcus's management and eventually passed to his children. The tradition of partnership that Victoria and Matthew had established became a family value, passed down through generations. Zimmerman women were expected to be as involved in ranch management as the men. Zimmerman men were expected to value intelligence and capability in their partners. Years later, historians studying the role of women in the development of the American West would often cite Victoria Zimmerman as an example of the unrecognized contributions women made to building the frontier. But those who'd known her understood that her greatest contribution wasn't just what she accomplished, but how she accomplished it. Through genuine partnership with a man who had the wisdom to recognize that a smart wife wasn't a threat, but a blessing. The story of how they met became family legend. How Matthew had sought out Victoria specifically because she'd been rejected for being too intelligent. How he'd told her he needed a partner, not a decoration. How they'd built not just a successful ranch but a marriage that was ahead of its time and a model for what was possible. Their great-great-grandchildren would grow up hearing those stories, understanding that they came from a long line of partnerships built on respect and equality. The world had changed dramatically since 1884 when Victoria stood in the street of Lusk holding a rejection letter, but the truth that she and Matthew had lived remained constant. Intelligence was something to be celebrated, not hidden. Partnership was stronger than hierarchy. And love, real love, wasn't about one person diminishing themselves for another. It was about two people building each other up, making each other better, creating together something neither could have achieved alone. That was the legacy Victoria and Matthew left behind. Not just land and wealth, but a vision of what marriage could be. They'd taken the conventions of their time and dared to do something different, something better. And in doing so, they'd created a love story that lasted not just for their lifetime, but for all the generations that followed. In the end, being rejected for being too smart was the best thing that ever happened to Victoria Jensen, because it led her to a man who didn't want a decoration. He wanted a partner. And together, they proved that partnership built on respect, equality, and love was the strongest foundation of all.